G'day Flosstube, Anna aka Moranalis. Welcome back to my cross-stitching channel. Thought I'd do something a little bit different today. I am working on trying to FFO my Horrific Halloween piece. So you'll remember this from a couple of months ago. My intention is to turn it into a wall hanging. I've watched several YouTube tutorials, not been entirely happy with any of them as far as how to go along doing it. I do not want to quilt through the middle of all that needlework, not going to happen. I want a pretty narrow hanging. Obviously I want it to hang straight. I bought the ghost sort of hanger that the model piece was done with, but I'm giving away my original patterns, but I'm fairly certain there was no instructions as to how to FFO it as per the model that was on the original patterns. Anyway, I'm pretty sure I looked. So I am doing a bit of a best guess as how to go about doing this based on the various tutorials I've seen, what I want to accomplish, and mash all that up together. So I thought I'd just take the opportunity to film it while I'm doing it. So you can see already been currently cut with 2.5-inch margins, which I figure will be more than I actually need. I'm kind of envisaging something that's pretty narrow. So, that will probably disappear in seams and whatnot, but it gives me heaps to play with. It's been ironed. I have cut a backing fabric of the same size, just a plain old gray, nothing too exciting, but I thought they went relatively well together. So that's roughly the same size as my cut piece of material. Same again, I have just scrap bit of batting cut to roughly the same size. The backing and the batting are maybe even just a bit larger than the stitching piece, but again, it'll all get trimmed down once it's stacked together. So I've also cut pieces to bind the quilt out of the same background fabric, and I've cut enough to make a hanging sleeve out of the background fabric. Idea being hopefully the hanging sleeve becomes more or less invisible. So because I do not want to quilt through my needlework, not going to happen, basically the intention is to use spray adhesive to stick the batting to the backing fabric. Obviously, I'm not going to use spray adhesive next to the needlework. So I will pause the video, I will adhere the batting and make the quilting stack, and then I will probably come back to you just handheld and we'll have a go and see what we decide are the next appropriate steps in this little project. Talk to you then. Bye. Okay, so I've adhered the backing to the batting with the spray adhesive. I won't say it was a great success. You can see the batting's gotten all gobby here. I think there might be a few tips and tricks to using that stuff that I'm not so great at, but learning exercise for everybody. It does not show too badly on the back side, a little bit. But let me put the thing back on. You'll notice, sorry, hard to do this one-handed. So compared to the piece that I've got of the actual stitching, there's kind of where the gobby is. The worst of it is from there down. So I may not, I may get lucky and be able to cut the bulk of that off anyway. So you can see my batting and backing is definitely a bit longer. The other thing I'm noting at this point is if I put the hanger in place, my hanging sleeve might run between my fingers there, But this is well wider than the actual hanger itself. So you run the risk, if there's too much weight there, of corners falling forward and things like that, I suppose. The other thing I was a bit concerned about, after I go through all this effort, I want this thing to hang straight. So one of the tutorials I was watching had a weighted rope they were embedding in the bottom binding. I couldn't, when I went to Google that, I kept getting weighted jump ropes, which was no help. I ended up finding this at my local Spotlight. It's a tape, it's got lead squares in there. It's deceptively heavy. Clearly I am not going to hide that in any binding. But when I figure out how tall I want this piece to be, I thought I might be able to sew it to the backing, you know, top and bottom, and it clearly you'll have two seams that show on the back, but from the front maybe it won't show so much. Not 100% sure if I will end up using that or not, but I wanted to, you know, get a piece and play with it and see what I thought anyway. Not inexpensive. That little 10-inch strip there was about $6, I think, at Spotlight. So that's Aussie dollars. So mathing, maybe $5 US. I don't know, maybe less. Anyway, so there's that to play with. At this point, I'm going to pin the stack together temporarily where I want it, and prep the binding to go around the outside. So I'll preface this next bit by saying I am by no means a quilter or a sewer or anything. I putz when I need to. I have a few basic skills. That's it. If you want professional advice, watch a different tutorial. But making the binding for the quilt hanging thing, I've cut 3 strips of my backing fabric. They're either 2 inches or 2.5. I can't remember off the top of my head. Doesn't really matter. I've pinned them perpendicular, right sides together. I've left that selvage hanging off and basically used it to try and line up so that my thing is straight. You can see I've pinned it on 2 sides of the square. That's because I'm going to sew from corner to corner. And after that's done and trimmed up, it's basically going to open in one continuous length of fabric with a diagonal sort of seam. So I've got 3 of those to sew together, and then we'll go on to the next bit. Okay, so I've prepped my binding. You can see I've got a big long ribbon of my backing material. I have folded it in half and ironed it so it lays nicely, and I'm not fighting with it. So the next thing to do is basically I have to make a commitment and cut this piece down to the size I actually want it. I was kind of thinking if I lined it up here, which the safety pins are in exactly the wrong spot, line the folded up again, edge against the stitching, you know, then I'll stitch. That would basically fold over and leave me a border like that. I still think that's too much border, so I will have to fiddle, probably come in here, figure about whatever that width is, and cut neatly all the way around. At that point I'll be able to pin my binding into place and actually start doing the binding. But unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave it there for today. I'm out of time, so I'll be back hopefully tomorrow. So back at this project, it is the next day, and my aim is to finish this today because I'd really like to show you the totally finished result on my next Flosstube next weekend. And I know during the week I won't get to have the time to finish this up. So let's keep at it. So you can see I've cut down the border that was there quite substantially. There's now only a 1/2 inch there. If my maths is right, I'm going to sew a seam at a 1/4 inch there, which will leave a 1/4 inch between the stitching edge and the binding seam. So that's the plan. Like I said, we're kind of winging it. But binding, you can see I've taken the raw edges of my binding, lined it up with the cut edge, pinned it all along. I'm going to sew at a 1/4 inch seam. The corners are where it gets funky, and I always have to double check with Google. But the basic idea is going to sew up here till the 1/4 inch. Then I'm going to flip the binding so it runs parallel to the top, and then I can flip it so it runs neatly against the top. And once all that is sewed, I will be able to flip it open, and it will have a very nice mitered edge that's quite neat and tidy. So that's the plan. Going to sew all the way around, and I will come back when I get to the starting point, because again, that's one of those tricky spots that I always have to Google. So for anybody who's not you know, a fluent quilter or whatever, I will show you how I manage that with my minimal skills, which amount to 4 weeks of quilting classes 20 years ago, plus having my hand held through one other quilt in the last 2 years. That's all the quilting I've got, guys. Yeah, bye. So you can see my seam. I've sewn up. The idea is the same width of your seam, so in my case 1/4 inch to a 1/4 inch from the top. I'm going to do that funky fold where I fold out and then run it across and pin it, and going to continue my way the rest of the way around. One other thing I will note for anybody who is not comfortable with their sewing machine, once upon a time my quilting teacher told me those feet that we use, they're called a walking foot, not a running foot. So just take your time. Several years ago, I had a foreign exchange student. I was helping her with her home ec assignment with my minimal skills. She was sewing a skirt or something. And man, she stomped on that pedal, and you know, the machine went blaring, and you cannot line up a straight seam like that. Take your time. You can see it's come out. I probably got a little bit more gap than I was expecting, but I'm not displeased with that at all. So take your time, make your way all the way around, and I'll come back when we have to do that funky join after I've had a Google. Okay, so we've made it around all 4 corners. I've only just barely attached that corner, enough that it's not trying to flop loose when I'm trying to get the end to finish neatly. Recommendation for beginner or people that aren't comfortable with what they're doing: check your corners. After every single one, just open it, make sure you're happy with how it looks when you fold it back. You know, I never get around a full piece with all 4 corners done properly the first time, and it's much better to rip out, you know, just the corner rather than have to kind of rejig the whole lot. So check your corners. I think it was that one that gave me grief this time. So to finish the thing, this is the starting point, the starting tail. So I ended up having to unpick an inch or so here because I didn't leave myself enough room. But I basically just folded down that end on a diagonal, and I've pressed it so that it stays put and cooperates for me. So now you can see when I line that up with my edge, I have a finished edge. There's no raw edges there. All I am going to do is this is really hard one-handed, so excuse the lack of neatness. I'm going to tuck that ending tail inside there, line it all up, and it will look much like this seam where we joined our binding pieces earlier. The difference will be that because we're going to sew along here, this will technically be unattached. You could use a blind stitch or something like that to attach it. I don't think I have ever bothered. For my purposes, you know, you get this neat and pinned, and I call it good at that point. So I will finish that up, flip it inside out, or not inside out, flip the binding around, and the last step will be to hand sew that binding all the way around the back. So I'll come back when we're working on that. So at this point, I've attached that binding all the way around. When you get to the part with the 4 layers where you've joined, make super sure that all 4 layers are joined on your seam, otherwise you end up with the binding that's half coming off. At this point, I'm basically going to wrap it around, and I've pinned it, aiming to be equal to where that seam line comes. So you end up, if you turn it over from the front, you end up with a very narrow border of binding. I'm guessing that my original strips were 2 inches wide. I never did go properly measure. I would say if this is your first time having it go, maybe sticking with the 2.5 would make your life a bit easier, give you a bit more to work with. The narrow works fine. It's just it's a bit tight and fiddly. So anyway, I'm going to put this back over again. Basically hand stitch all along where I've pinned to stitch that down. The corners are a bit putsy, but you're trying to get a nice mitered edge there, and then a nice mitered edge on that side, and clearly my pinning is not up to scratch, but I think this is one of those things where it's easier to line it up once you get up close. You know, you can hold it in place with by hand while you sew it together. So we will have a go all the way around, and then that is the wall hanging itself done. We will have to go on to doing the hanging sleeve. So I'll see you when we're ready to do that. So we have the binding sewn down all the way around. Some of these corners are a bit gobbier than I would like, and my corners don't meet up very nicely, but I'll call it passable. I think it's one of those tasks that practice makes perfect, and I just don't give it enough practice. So at this point, I need to make the hanging sleeve so that that will fit in there. I think that makes a nice width actually. So to make the hanging sleeve, you need, Google suggests 9 inches tall and as wide as the piece. Well, clearly this was measured to be when I had the 2.5 inches on either side, so now this is well too wide. And the 9-inch high is to make a pocket big enough to fit, you know, a full-size quilt on a bar, you know, that'd hang an entire quilt. That's probably a bit overkill for this little hanging. So I may do a bit maths and cut it down as well, so it's not quite as large a pocket, because of course all I'm fitting in there is these couple of little things. I will place the pocket right up the top so that it doesn't protrude up much. It just hangs kind of like that will be the idea. So first thing to do is obviously to cut down my fabric to however big I'm actually going to do it, and to hem in the 2 short sides. So I will do that, have a cup of coffee, and then come back and we'll go from there. So we've had a coffee and back at this hanging sleeve. You can see I've cut down the fabric for my sleeve to the same width as the hanging, and then I've rolled it over twice and pressed it so it'll stay put, and I will run a seam down each of those edges before I come back and position it to actually make the tube that will go through the hanger. The only thing I wanted to check at this point was to make sure the width of my tube, you know, I was going to be able to fit the whole sleeve within that gap there. So I think that will be just fine. So I'll be back then. So I've got the seam sewed on either side. I always double check because I inevitably miss something in catching down one of my folds there, but I seem to have done well this time. I don't know if I mentioned in the last clip, I did keep the full 9-inch height that Google was recommending. So I decided I'd stick with what I know, and I don't know whether or not it'd work as well with a smaller height or not. It seems overkill for a small hanging. Anyway, next step, fold wrong sides together, obviously neatly, and run a 1/2-inch seam that we will then turn around and press open. This is really hard one-handed, guys. We'll press it open so that this seam will basically lay against the back of the wall hanging and nobody will see it. We'll come back when that's done. Okay, so you can see I've got my tube, I've got the seam pressed apart. I also marked a 1/2-inch up from the bottom end, and I tried to lay it out so that the seam was more or less in the middle between those pins and the top. I'm all cool with approximate, so it's not really measured that specifically. So what I'm going to do now is basically, line up the pouch with the sort of binding, and I'm going to stitch. You know, I think I could have even made the sleeve a bit narrower. I think it'd fit better if it was entirely in the binding. Anyway, going to line up the binding and the sleeve and hand stitch those in place. I'm also going to hand stitch the sides down to the pins. So I've taken the pins out, so it's a bit hard to see, but there's where the sewing starts, where my 1/2-inch pin was. Goes all the way around. Don't look at the neatness. Again, practice makes perfect, and I spend too much time stitching, not doing this quilting stuff. Around to the other 1/2-inch. Now, if you were doing like a full quilt, at this point, you'd basically use that 1/2-inch and sew across at that point. That would let this pocket puff up a bit to accommodate a larger rod. When I had that pinned in place and on the hanger to test, it was too much. The quilt hung funny, or the hanging hung funny. It kind of fell forward. You know, a rod that they're hanging a full-size quilt on is much thicker than that bit. So I have opted to, instead of that 1/2-inch business, I'm just going to sew across the bottom so that there's no extra pucker or give in that pocket at all. And when I had this pinned in place and hanging, it hung nicely. So that's what we're going to do. So, Flosstube, that's it. It's all ready to hang for Halloween. I'm very pleased to have that little project off my to-do list. So I'll show it again in my regular update for anybody who doesn't sit through this. If anybody has any recommendations or tutorials that finish it closer to what was modeled on the patterns, where there's no binding, it just goes straight from your linen over a nice edge, I'd be interested to know. I kind of debated how to accomplish that, but I think this turned out well. So look forward to hanging it up at Halloween, and I'll see you next time.